We got Chris Forsberg here. We also have Phil Perry, whose face lit up when I said maybe Marcus Smart would pass the ball instead of shoot it instead. Phil, I know you, for one, love the idea of Bradley Beal coming here. Why?
I do, because of the things that you mentioned in your monologue. What do the Celtics need? And we know, listen, they're 2 games away from a title. We all understand that. But what do they need? They need someone who can handle the basketball, because as soon as the ball pressure got turned up by the Bucks and then the Heat and then the Warriors, the Celtics offense sputtered. They were atrocious down the stretch offensively, especially in the half court. So that's number one. Number two, shooting. How about somebody that can take a little bit of pressure off of Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum so that they don't have to play 40 minutes a night when the games become important? Bradley Beal checks both of those boxes. And oh, by the way, Chris, he's very good friends with Jason Tatum. They have a great relationship.
Is this true?
Well, listen, I think this matters because I don't think he's a guy who I don't understand why people would look at this and say, well, he's a guy who needs to take 20 shots a night. Says who? If he comes here and he likes his role and he likes his situation, does he have to be the guy he's always been for the Washington freaking Wizards? Of course not. He would adjust his game to fit in, especially with a great, great friend on the roster who is clearly the alpha, or should be.
It's okay. So look, I don't
disagree. Are you going to rain
with...
on our Bradley Beal parade?
No.
Like
I'm going to tell you. I've been told unequivocally, as long as Jason Tatum is here and as long as he is best friends with Bradley Beal, we can't be ignorant and ignore the possibility that there just might come a time where Jason Tatum is like, yo, you want me here? Then go get my buddy. And the Celtics have to be responsive to that. But I will say, don't go check his shooting splits if you're looking for another shooter from last year. They weren't great.
He was hurt.
I mean, if he was okay, and that's fine. You can chalk up to whatever you want. The Wizards too. But I do think that the Celtics have easier means, as Trenni laid out in the opening, to ways to improve this roster without necessarily having to gut yourself the way you might have to go get a Bradley Beal. Again, it's still on the radar for as long as we're here. I'm going to get into the how it would happen and whatnot, but it would take an Anthony Davis-like power play, and then the Celtics would still have to give up multiple first-round picks and probably young talent. There is a far less prickly path to get a player of Bradley Beal's caliber. Maybe not the superstar level, and certainly not Jason Tatum's best friend, but I just think maybe that ship has sailed a little bit. And the other factor here, Al Horford, who we all said was going to be sort of that contract you'd need to include, I think there's a good chance he rides it out next year and they figure out what happens after that, as opposed to.
I have 2 questions, but I'm going to start with my second based on that. You would rather stick with Al Horford than go for Bradley Beal?
So a couple things here. One, I think Al is very good, and you don't have any backup plan there at the 4. In fact, I think Brad Stevens' biggest obstacle this offseason is figuring out what comes next at the 4 spot. But the fact of the matter is, you also have to look at it like this. Al Horford is represented by Jason Glushon, who represents probably 40% of your players, including Jaylen Brown, who has a contract coming due. It would be a little bit awkward to move out Al Horford at this spot when I think they have sort of committed to him in some ways next season, and he wants to know his future coming into the year. Now, you can always audible off of that if you feel like it. I just think it maybe sets up a little bit more difficult path down the road.
The only person I would be worried about personally offending on this roster right now would be Jason Tatum. I think if you're trying to do good business, even if it means making things awkward with some other players because of agent relationships and things like that, Jason Tatum's the only one I really care about when it comes to that. And Bradley Beal would sort of take care of that concern that I would have, bringing him aboard and making Jason Tatum happy. To me, although we all love Al Horford and what he did at the end of the season, I think you have to look at this pragmatically and say, is a 37-year-old Al Horford, which is what he will be next year, the guy or one of the 3 or 4 guys you want to build around moving forward for a team that should be contending for a championship?
I just want to throw it back on you. You sub out Al Horford next year for Bradley Beal. Do you think the Celtics are a championship team?
Probably not, because then you are missing size. Then who do you spell a Robert Williams with, right? Robert Williams can't go out there
or
and
just
play.
Who do you put on the back line that allows Robert Williams to thrive? There's no answer there, and I think that's the biggest thing the Celtics have to look at moving forward is who's that next guy? Are you going out and getting a John Collins? Are you going out and finding and drafting a 4? To me, that's the way bigger issue than finding just another scorer, because there's a lot of guys in this league that can score, especially when you put the talent that the Celtics have around them. And so I just think it's fun to daydream about the guys like Bradley Beal. It's a lot easier.
To me, it's all sliding scale, though. If you could get a little bit of scoring, Trenni, and you have to sacrifice a little size or a little defense, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the show, maybe you'd be willing to do it.
Maybe you can get a smaller piece, and maybe Bradley Beal would come here for a little less just because, Tomase, let me start with you. Do you think that if Beal can't come to Boston, if that's just a deal that the Celtics can't make, that he would rather stay in Washington? What do you think are his options? He says he's made a decision, but we don't know what that decision is.
Yeah, I mean, Trenni, obviously, I have no idea what Bradley Beal's planning. I will say, just from the Boston perspective, I look at it like Phil Perry. You have to do everything in your power in today's NBA to keep players in cities that maybe aren't first choices. And as much as we love Boston, it's not always the first choice of players long term. So if you can bring in somebody who gives you that much better of a chance of keeping Jason Tatum here, I think that is worth moving the heavens and the earth for if you're the Celtics.
Ryan, would you have to move heavens and earth, though, to get Bradley Beal? What would you have to give up to make a Beal trade work?
I think that's the problem, Trenni and John. Celtics fans don't want to hear this, but I think Jaylen Brown would have to be in the deal. And that's why I think there is a path for the Celtics to acquire Bradley Beal, but not over the next couple weeks. Bradley Beal makes $64 million more if he opts out of his contract and then re-signs in Washington. He can do a 5-year extension with the Wizards. That's the only team in the league he can sign for that length with. And if we think about it logically, guys, if the NBA is serious about enforcing tampering and other teams not talking to players, well, if Bradley Beal has already made his decision, to me, that means he's going back to Washington. That's the only team he can talk with at this point. So I think the Celtics could acquire Beal, but I think the way that would happen would be a trade, either maybe at the trade deadline or even next offseason. I think it's very unlikely that Beal ends up in a Celtics uniform to start next season.
What is that path? And obviously, Ryan, I know there's no tampering allowed, but I'm sure that Jason Tatum and Bradley Beal are just having friendly conversations about what it might be like to team up here.
Oh, no question about it. From a trade perspective, assuming Beal wanted to force his way to Boston and the Wizards were willing to cooperate, a sign and trade is the clear path. Other than that, guys, Boston would have to gut basically their entire roster other than Tatum and maybe Brown. You'd have to get rid of all your depth that you've accumulated. The Robert Williams of the world, Al Horford, all those guys would have to go out and it would still be a tight squeeze. This is one of the issues Miami ran into when they built their super team alongside LeBron, Dwayne Wade, and Chris Bosh. They had basically minimum slots to fill out the rest of the roster, and they lost to the Mavericks that year in 2011. So that's why I think it probably is a sign and trade. Al Horford's contract would be likely to be in it at $26.5 million on an expiring deal. And then what does Washington want? Do they want Robert Williams, Grant Williams, draft picks? Those are Boston's most valuable assets outside of Tatum and Brown. But again, I think it's highly unlikely. As much as we love discussing it, I think it's highly unlikely Beal is headed to Boston over the next few weeks.
Well, Tomase, you said Boston's not much of a destination, that as much as we love it, players don't always seem to love it. But it seems that it's not just Jason Tatum that Bradley Beal is fond of. He also seems to have a soft spot for our fine city.
To see Jason be in the situation he's in, to be in Boston, to be in a sport town, to be in basketball mecca, essentially, there's no story better written for him.
Tomase, is it possible that the perception of Boston is starting to change? That maybe players look at a young core and say, hey, that's a place I want to play?
Maybe. They also have ears, so they heard bleep you Draymond and bleep you Kyrie and saw things thrown at Kyrie. So I think all that matters. I actually want to go back to something Ryan said, which it's not the time right now to go get Bradley Beal. I actually think a year from now works much better for this Celtics team and this Celtics core. Bring back Al Horford for a year. See if Rob Williams can stay healthy. Marcus Smart, find out if this is the best you're ever going to get out of him or if he can still improve. Basically run it back with this group. And then if Beal is still there a year from now at age 29, I actually think that timing might be better than right now.
Is there any way, Ryan, that if Bradley Beal really wants to come to Boston, that he says to Washington, I'm not going to play for you. I only want to go to Boston. You get it done however you need to get it done. And Boston doesn't have to give up a huge package to go out and get it. Or is that just a pipe dream?
Yeah, theoretically, it's possible. I know Celtics Nation would love that. In reality, that's difficult, Trenni, because keep in mind he would be leaving north of $60 million on the table, not re-signing with the Wizards. And then he would have to get Washington to agree. And Washington obviously has to do what's best for their franchise and their roster. Think of the players who have left over the last couple of years. John Wall, Russell Westbrook, recently at the trade deadline, Spencer Dinwiddie and Davis Bertans. So unless the Wizards are willing to go into a full-blown rebuild and the Celtics are willing to throw in a bunch of picks and pick swaps and young players and things like that, maybe that's a possibility. But I think if Bradley Beal says, I want to go to Boston, the Wizards say, that's great. Bring us a bunch of picks and pick swaps and things that either, if the Celtics don't have them right now, they need to go get them from another team. That's the only way we'll play ball, because we don't really care about what's doing what's best for a conference rival. We have to do what's best for our own franchise, not keeping Bradley Beal happy on his way out the door.